はい、クロスディグ101始まります。今日のテーマはですね、トランプ 2.0 とデジタル課税です。ちょっと難しいテーマなんですが、これから本当に重要になってくるので、ぜひ皆さんと一緒に考えていきたいと思います。で、このテーマを考えるにあたって本当にふさわしいゲストをですね、今日フランスのパリからお呼びしました。パスカル・サンタマンさんというもともと OECD の局長さんなんですが、彼が本当にキーパーソンなので一緒に議論していきたいと思います。ちょっと議論の前に説明すると、今までです、デジタル課税という議論が国際的にありました。いろんな巨大 IT 企業とか多国籍企業がいろんなところでビジネスをしていると。でもそういった企業はどうしてもその税金が低い国を利用して、税負担を抑えるという傾向があったんですが、それをやめてきちんと税金を取って、消費者がいろんな国で、その税負担、税を回収してその利益を分け合おうという、そういったグローバルな仕組みを作ろうとしてて、進んでたんですけど、トランプさんが出てきて今変わっているという状況があります。こんなことをちょっと議論してみたいですし、きっとですね、今後のビジネスを占う上で大事な議論になると思います。では早速ゲストをご紹介しましょう。Pascal Sandman, welcome to our show.
Thank you very much.
So I'll introduce to our audience in Japanese first, so then go into our discussion.
Absolutely.
パスカルさんはですね、今ブランズウィックグループというヨーロッパのコンサル会社にいるんですけれど、もともとフランスの財務省を経て OECD の租税政策税務行政センターの局長を務めています。本当に国際課税のプロで、この分野はですね、日本も結構貢献しているので、日本のいろんな財界人あるいは政治家とも親しい方です。スイスのローザンヌ大学で教授を兼任しています。I just explained how wonderful you are.
Sounds good.
Okay, so this time I will talk about global digital tax, and it's an important topic. However, it's very difficult to understand. So, could you elaborate what the system is about and how Japan contributed to the discussion?
That's a big question.
Yes, a big question.
Thanks for having me. Very happy
thank
to
you.
be here.
But first in Japan? First time in Japan?
It's the 40th time.
40.
So I'm a usual customer of being in Japan. Yes.
Do you like Japan?
I'm a big fan of Japan. I've worked very closely with Japanese colleagues, with the Japanese Ministry of Finance, and I'm an absolute fan of this country.
Thank you. And you have is it a Japanese flag? Or?
It is indeed a Japanese sign. It represents the Order of the Rising Suns that was provided to me and decision by the Emperor of Japan. So it's the greatest honor I could receive, and I'm very proud to wear it in Japan.
It's wonderful.
Thank you.
Okay,
Thank you very much.
Let's go on to global digital tax.
So, you have global companies, and in particular tech companies,
yes.
Social platforms, and others who have conquered the world without necessarily having armies on the ground.
Do you mean like Google, Facebook?
Absolutely. These companies can do what we call scale without mass. They can reach out the whole world with only a small team in Mountain View or in California,
yes.
right? And the question for governments is, where do they pay their taxes? Because usually you pay your taxes where you're located.
Right.
Let's say the US. Well, US companies can be aggressive, so actually they shifted their intellectual property or the ownership of the brand to low-tax countries, Bermuda, Cayman, and paying nothing in Japan when the customers are in Japan. For more than 10 years, governments have said, we need to fix this.
Yes.
And there has been an effort, which was led by the OECD. I was in charge, working closely with the Japanese government, which was prominent in the conversation. So we tried to fix the issue by saying there should be new rules. I mean, these rules are international rules. You have tax treaties which bind governments so they cannot do what they want. So Japan today cannot tax a tech company on the profit made in Japan because the existing rules don't allow. So you need to change the rules. And that's what we try to do by saying, where should the profit be? In a tax haven, no, clearly not. It should be more in Japan, shared between Japan and the US, but for that, you need to change the rules. And that's the conversation which is still happening at the OECD, and we don't know whether the US will say we stop the conversation and don't even try to tax our companies, otherwise we'll shoot you dead with trade measures or tax sanctions, and we'll see what the US will do on that front.
So let me be clear. So before the discussion, even though the global companies do business in Japan, there are a lot of consumers and Japanese consumers, but the Japanese government will not able to tax that company because they were located elsewhere else.
That's it. They are located elsewhere, and in Japan, they do not have enough of a physical presence. The rules, which were elaborated a century ago, but which are binding on Japan and others, provide that a country can tax a foreign company when it has a physical presence. We call it a permanent establishment in the tax jargon. It means you really need to be present physically.
Do you mean like there's an office, there's a human being?
You need to have an office, you need to have staff, you need to do all the activities which will generate taxable profit. But what happens with a digitalized economy, a globalized economy, a financialized economy, is that you no longer need a brick and mortar building to do business in the country. And this is where the international tax rule, they were developed at the League of Nations in 1928.
Where there was no internet, no smartphone.
It was another world.
Yes.
And now we need other rules, but these rules, to be adopted, you need the agreement of all the countries. They agreed on principle on the 8th of October 2021.
How many countries agreed?
140 countries.
140, that's a lot.
We established an international organization at the OECD to bring all the countries, and guess what? This was created in Kyoto in June 2016, where we had all these countries coming together, and almost 5 years later, in 2021, they agreed new rules. So you would say if we have new rules, we're fine. But these new rules would require what we call a multilateral treaty to turn this into hard law. But for that, you need the US to sign, and it doesn't seem the US is ready to sign.
Wow. Is it because of the Trump 2.0, the new president?
So the new president of the US is doing two things. One, he's saying, we don't know exactly whether he will pursue the negotiation, we doubt it, but he's saying, negotiation or not, if you try to do it on yourself, on your own, right? Because you can say, I cannot do it globally with an agreement, but I can take my own measures. I can do what we call a digital service tax, which means that you will tax the transactions. So the advertisement paid by the sushi restaurant next door to Google, right? The profit of Google cannot be taxed in Japan, but Japan could take 3% of the payment. That's what you call a digital service tax. The French have introduced that. The French are the world champion in tax. They tax everything.
Yes, I know, yes.
You know, right?
You're from France, yes.
Indeed. The Italians, the Brits, the Turks, the Indians have done that. And what President Trump says is, if you do that, I'm going to double corporate income tax rate of your companies in the US.
Wow.
Or I'm going to take trade sanctions. So that's the conversation which is taking place. And there is another dimension that we haven't talked about, which is we established in 21, also 130 countries, a global minimum tax of 15%. And President Trump says, I'm not implementing it. And if you do on US companies, I take trade sanctions as well. So you can see the trouble that is arising.
Because this is a very, the global tax is an international multilateral system. But what I hear from President Trump is that he likes deals between two countries, bilateral. Does this contradict with your system in the global tax system? Because President Trump likes deals and not international cooperation.
Absolutely. Well, for the time being, President Trump likes sticks, right? So you have many sticks which are agitated to threaten countries. You can see the increase of the trade tariffs almost everywhere. But you're absolutely right. He doesn't like multilateralism because he thinks it's against the interest of the US. I would respectfully disagree with that. And he will seek to get bilateral deals by twisting the arms of the different countries and telling them, you cannot tax American companies. It's a bit of an American way of you do unilateral measures which are extraterritorial, but you don't allow your partners to do the same to you.
So before President Trump, when was the new system supposed to go into effect?
We had these two pillars, right? The pillar one is on the tech companies. It goes beyond tech. It includes pharmaceutical, it includes brand companies, and the negotiation was still going on for this multilateral convention. We'll see whether it stops or not, and if it stops, it may trigger digital service taxes, including in Japan. We'll see what happens. On the global minimum tax, that was different because to implement the global minimum tax, you don't need a multilateral treaty. Countries can do it on their own. Japan has introduced the global minimum tax in its legislation last year and will complete it in the coming days. And you have more than 50 countries which have done that, which means that all the companies in the world, including American companies, including, by the way, Chinese companies, even though the US and China are not implementing the minimum tax, but given that the other countries are implementing the minimum tax, all the companies in the world, including US and Chinese, will be taxed at least at 15% effective. This mechanism is in place. President Trump will try to stop it. I think he will not manage to stop it. There will be some tensions, but this global minimum tax of 15% has occurred. That means you can no longer put your profit in a tax haven and pay no taxes there.
Do you think he will actually stop it? Because I read your paper published recently, Will Trump 2.0 spell the end of global cooperation on tax? And this made perfect sense to me, and I believe this global cooperation tax will benefit all the world, including the United States. Do you think he will understand that?
No.
No. Okay.
Well, I think what President Trump
Yes.
has probably in mind, we don't know, and we need a few more weeks to get clarity because there will be, I don't know if people are aware, but every 6 months you have a big meeting of all finance ministers of the world in Washington, D.C. For what we call the IMF and the World Bank spring meetings and then the fall meetings. So at the end of April, the US may clarify its position on the IMF, on the World Bank, on the tax deal, on the trade measures. So we'll have to see what they do. But for the time being, what we can expect or anticipate is that the US new government doesn't like taxes and they want to cut taxes.
Yes.
And they don't want other countries to collect taxes on American companies.
That's right. And most of the global companies are located in America, so that's why Trump is...
And he's trying to repatriate
yes.
business
Yes.
in the US
Yes.
to be attractive, except that it's always nice to cut taxes, but then you increase the deficit.
Right.
Now, the US, how do they fund their deficit? They print dollars because it's the reserve currency. But at some point, you may have some challenges because China or the Europeans or Japan may stop buying US bonds. So you can see that the tax compensation is linked to trade, is linked to monetary policy, basically is at the core of the geoeconomics which is happening now before us. And it's so new what the US is doing, including with its traditional allies, that it's hard to guess what's going to happen.
So suppose President Trump will not change his mind, and what would happen if the U.S. will retreat from this global tax initiative? What kind of influence will affect the global business and also the Japanese business landscape?
That's the big question today, indeed. So the U.S. president on the 20th of January said, I withdraw from the OECD deal.
Yeah.
Was
it a surprise to you?
No.
No? Okay.
No.
Okay.
All the more as the US was not really part of the deal. Why? Because this deal was negotiated with President Biden. President Biden agreed it was his priority, and that's why on the 8th of October 2021, you had everybody agreeing. President Biden gave a few phone calls to a few countries to get them to agree. Except that President Biden failed to get it passed in the US. So the US did not implement it, but it had been designed in an devilish manner. I'm the father of things, so I can take the blame.
Okay.
So that even if the US doesn't implement, if you have a critical mass of countries implementing, all the companies, including the US, will be impacted. And today, with 50 countries implementing, Japan, Korea, the European countries, the UK, Canada, South Africa, and I can name many others, they are implementing. And if the US doesn't take the minimum tax on US profit located in Cayman, to take an example, the Japanese, the Europeans will take the profit. If in the US, a company were to be taxed below 15%, which could be the case, the nominal rate in the US of corporate income tax is 21%. And if you get some tax credit, you can reduce your effective rate below 15%. With the mechanism of the minimum tax, Japan, the UK, Canada, the Europeans can take the difference. And that's where President Trump says, I'm not going to implement your minimum tax, but don't implement it on my companies. This is what is at stake.
It's a very complicated issue right now. How can we fix it? Yeah.
It is complicated and simple at the same time. If we try to simplify, for decades, we have had a race to the bottom on corporate income tax.
Yes.
40 years ago, corporate income tax was at 50%, 50. Today, it's around 25% in Japan, in France, in many
around
countries.
that range, yes.
But actually, most of the profits were taxed much below because of what we've seen on tech companies. You put your profit in Singapore, you put your profit in Hong Kong, you put your profit in Ireland.
Yeah, where the taxes are low, yes.
And that's the race to the bottom.
Yes.
And countries decided after the global financial crisis in 2008 that they had to stop the race to the bottom. Why? Because if multinational companies don't pay their fair share of tax, who does? The man and the woman in the street.
Right.
The citizen. So you have to increase VAT, VAT. In Japan, your VAT is very low, so at some point it will have to be increased. But you have to increase personal income tax and other taxes on those who cannot move, the workers. And it's unfair. So that's why the G20 countries, the Europeans, Japan, who took the lead there, but also the US under Biden, said we need to stop it. And this is what is at stake. So it's simple.
Yes.
You need to stop the race to the bottom. But the new US administration says no bottom, zero is good.
To me, I think this is a kind of ethical issue. We need to fix this in order to create a fair and a free world. So what are the tech companies or multinational companies saying? Are they willing to change?
Do you know taxpayers who are happy to pay more taxes? I don't.
Maybe this is a stupid question. Okay.
I don't.
Okay.
No, but that's
Okay.
not at all stupid. That's a very good question. So the companies actually are torn between recognizing the system is a bit broken and needs a fix, but a fix which would not cost them too much. So the tech companies have said we need this global solution that all the countries agree, and then we'll pay the taxes. What tech companies...
So everyone pays the price.
And tech companies say, rightfully, we don't like unilateral measures, the digital service taxes, because they're all different in all the countries, and that costs a lot of money to everybody, while a coordinated global solution would be better. But that's the opposite of what President Trump wants to do now.
Right. So let's talk about Japan, the role of Japan. So first of all, can you elaborate how Japan played a role in this creating this initiative?
So these tax initiatives are conducted by member countries of the OECD, and Japan is an extremely important member of the OECD. The OECD has 38 member countries, from the US to Japan, with Australia, with the European countries, Mexico, Chile, and a few others. And what we did on tax was, because of the G20, you know, in the G20 you have China, Brazil, South Africa, which are not at the OECD. They are not the rich countries. So we brought them on an equal footing in Kyoto, back in 2016. And we did that negotiation. Now, this negotiation is between countries, between the ministries of finance of countries. The ministers followed that at the G20 meeting, and then their tax people came to Paris to negotiate the deal. Japan played a special role there because Aso-san, the finance minister for
Taro Aso-san.
Absolutely, the finance minister of Japan for many years, he had a special voice in the G20. He was listened to, and he made this a top priority. And he had very good teams, in particular Asakawa-san, who was recently the president of the Asian Development Bank. He was the vice minister of finance, and he was the chair of the body which was handling the negotiation, and I was the director in charge of writing the paper. So we worked very closely with Japan, who had a special voice there, which was heard by others, and which facilitated reaching a deal. Reaching a deal with 130 countries, including China, including the US, including the Europeans, including African countries.
That's a difficult job.
It's difficult, especially at the time of COVID, when everything was virtual, but that's what we achieved.
I interviewed Kanda Masa for this show, and he was also talking about the digital tax, and I didn't know that Japan played such a huge role in creating this initiative?
No, absolutely.
Yeah.
Japan has been key on international tax because Japanese companies are compliant. They are not aggressive. They don't shift their profit to tax haven. Unlike American companies or European companies, which are more aggressive.
Okay.
The culture here is very different from what it is in other countries, and therefore, it's the interest of the country, it's the interest of Japan that other companies in the rest of the world would pay a bit more tax to level the playing field with Japanese companies. So that's another reason for which Japan was active.
So you came to Japan 40 times, and do you think Japanese business professionals are different from people in the United States, or do you think there's a different ethics or something?
The answer is a plain yes.
Plain yes, okay.
Oh yeah, absolutely.
Okay.
No, of course, I mean, and you know it, right? Compliance in the Japanese culture.
Very honest.
Respect, honesty is different from what you can find elsewhere. I'm not saying that multinational elsewhere are dishonest.
No,
and so
of course, yes.
I'm not saying
yes.
that. But I'm saying that in Japan, if you pay the amount of tax you owe and you will not do tricks to reduce it, when in other countries, it's part of the culture. It's a fiduciary duty to the stakeholders to reduce, to the shareholders, to reduce taxation. So the points of view are very different. And that's why I engaged 10 years ago with Keidan Ren, for Keidan Ren to have a voice, the Japanese business voice in the negotiation, so that we would not hear only from American companies or European companies.
So having that said, what can Japan play a role in fixing this problem and also moving this initiative forward, even in the Trump era? Because, like you mentioned kindly, that the Japanese business culture is very honest, very decent, very transparent. And at the same time, I think Japanese diplomacy is good at bridging the gap between countries and regions, Asia, Europe, United States, Africa. What role can Japan play?
You've said it.
Okay.
Building a bridge.
Building a bridge.
And Japan has always been extremely helpful in building bridges between the Europeans and the US. And I think that's the role Japan plays nowadays in the G20. There was a G20 finance ministers meeting 3 weeks ago in Cape Town in South Africa. For the first time, an African country is leading the G20, and there was no clarity on the US position. Japan tried to bring that clarity. They couldn't because the Secretary of Treasury didn't go to Cape Town, and therefore the meeting was a bit lost. But the next meeting will be at the spring meeting of the IMF, and here again, I know that Japan is trying to collect information, to gather intelligence, to share it with other G7 countries, with European countries, to try to find solutions, with the goal of limiting the trade wars on the one hand, but keeping the integrity of what was built, in particular this global minimum tax, the transparency work, the exchange of information, the tax cooperation. If I may summarize all that in a word, the tax regulation of globalization, which is what the G20 has done since 2008, regulating globalization from a tax perspective to make tax fairer, so that it's not only the same, the ones who work and cannot move who pay the tax for the others.
Do you think if we want to continue this initiative, do you think it will lead to maybe trade war or global conflicts between countries and regions?
The answer is yes, but I would add the trade war is here. So it's not as if you would just have the tax issue generating a trade war. I would say the tax aspect is drowned into an ocean of trade sanctions which are there. So does it make a big difference? I'm not so sure.
Also, we now have artificial intelligence. Do you think that AI will make global business more complicated and the more necessity for a global tax system because of AI?
I think it's part of it. I mean, what we've seen since the 1920s is globalization, financiarization, digitalization, and AI is just the extreme of digitalization, which means that you need to revisit these old rules on trying to find out which country should tax what profit. And if you don't better share this, it will be the winner takes it all. It will be the country which have done the innovation which will take it all. The US maybe China, and other countries will lag behind. So you need fairness. You need fairness because it's a question of fairness, but also you need fairness for economic efficiency. If the system is not fair, then you fuel populism. And we can see what happens when you have populism. You have protectionism, you have the rise of tensions, and at the end, you have wars, and we don't want that.
So throughout this conversation so far, I can tell that, Pascal, you have put a lot of energy into fixing this problem. Why is that? What drives you? What is the motivation?
I was a civil servant. I no longer am, but I was a civil servant. And when you're a civil servant, you want to serve. So you want to achieve something which makes sense economically and which makes sense in terms of fairness. So that has been the driver. And I was lucky because with the global financial crisis, you had a wake-up call to the world. And the G20 leaders, whether they were left-wing or right-wing, all agreed that we had to fix it. The previous time was the League of Nations a century ago. So we had a window of opportunity which happens once in a century. So I was very lucky to be there at that time.
Do you still have hope? Do you think we can overcome this problem?
I wish I had hope, and I'm an optimist. So at the end of the day, multilateralism will prevail, I hope. We are going through a new paradigm, and not only in terms of tax, in terms of trade, but also in terms of defense. I'm a European, I live in France, Russia is not far, Ukraine is even closer, and the fact that the US withdraws is a big shock, I think, for all the Europeans. I guess you can transcribe that in the region as well, and you can see that it's a new world that we're facing.
Right.
If countries keep together, and I think Japan, the European countries, the UK, Canada, and others can make the rule of law prevail, fairness prevail, and this is what is at stake in the current months and in the coming weeks and months.
I believe in liberal democracy, fair world, rule of law, but when I saw the meeting with President Zelensky and President Trump in the Oval Office, and also Vice President J.D. Vance, I was worried that the United States itself is trying to break this world order. Are you worried about it? Or
Yes.
Okay.
I share the same feeling.
Okay.
When you see this, you say it's the world upside down.
Yeah.
In a more technocratic manner, you could say a UN resolution in the Security Council, which is adopted by Russia and the US, where the Europeans are abstaining, is something which is deeply troubling. So we are, I think, entering a new world. And in this new world, we need to define new boundaries. And probably it will be something like coalition of the willing. We haven't talked about something which would have been the first question 3 months ago, climate change.
That's right.
Right?
Yeah.
We forgot about that.
We shouldn't forget about
it. The climate
it.
is changing.
It's changing.
It was snowing here in Tokyo last week, and today it's springtime. So there is something wrong. That's an urgency. We need to address that.
Right.
A coalition of the willing, if US doesn't want to be part of it, coalition of the willing is necessary. And here, China is part of this conversation. You have unprecedented level of inequalities. You need to address that because it's not economically efficient and socially it's not fair, it's not just. Brazil, who chaired the G20 last year, said, let's address that. Let's do a global minimum tax on individual. I don't believe this is possible, but at least you have a direction of travel, right? This is completely gone. I mean, now tell the US administration that you want to tax ultra-high net worth individual. I mean, say you want to tax Elon Musk and the response will be get lost. Don't do that. But this is something which needs to be done. And if we don't do it, paradoxically, this will fuel populism. And the paradox of populism is that they elect people who are against the interests of the people.
Right. You're right. We should talk about climate change and human rights and global divide, but President Trump completely spun the conversation. We're not talking about that. So You are absolutely right.
And we'll see. We don't know how much time it will last, this agitation. We'll see what the US position is, whether it will be as dramatic as we may fear. Maybe at the spring meetings, the US will announce they're leaving the World Bank. You saw what they did with the aid in Africa.
Yes.
You were talking about Africa, and Japan is playing a role there. In Asia with the Asian Development Bank, but also in Africa by providing aid. The US overnight cut the aid, including the aid on health, which was supporting Africans to fight AIDS, right?
Yes.
And this is a dramatic change that we'll have to live with.
Okay, Pascal, I think we need to wrap up. Any final comments, final words for our viewers? Yeah.
Well, thank you for the invitation.
Yes.
I believe we need to follow very carefully what will happen in the coming months. And there is an opportunity. It's a new world, and in this new world, we need to think out of the box. So let's see the silver line, even though the picture is pretty bleak currently.
Okay. I'll ask our readers to subscribe to our channel. チャンネル登録ぜひお願いします。またいろいろと海外からのゲストを呼んでいきたいと思います。So Pascal Santaman, welcome and thank you for joining our show.
Thank you so much. ありがとうございます。